And Walter Wynn is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Good morning, everybody. I told you when we started this out, we'll have some little bitty things and some things we can see. So last week we could see strawberries, and the week before we could see something else. This week we're going to stare at our big toe. Um, Raghu was here earlier with the UF Health Group about 2 or 3 months ago, and I was staring at his name on his chart, and he said, "Just call me Raghu." So Raghuveer Chandrashekhar is going to tell us today about our big toe, and he spoiled my entrance. I was going to say, we all have a hallux and we never knew it. In fact, we have two of them, which makes halices, but he's going to tell us about the big toe. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hello. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Wynn, for this wonderful opportunity and also to share with everybody what we've been doing at the Smart House. Oh, how about now? Is that okay? Okay, awesome. Hello? Yeah, okay. So as you all know, I'm going to be talking about the great toe and great toe strength and why you should care about it. And you've all probably seen me at some point here as part of some other demonstration or workshop that we've conducted. Uh, I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Occupational Therapy. I'm in the program for Rehabilitation Sciences, but my background is actually in mechanical engineering. And my interests, ever since joining the lab under my mentor, Dr. Hongwu Wang, has been to look at technology very differently as compared to most engineers. And I might have told this to multiple people. My passion is to work on low-tech technology solutions for people with disabilities or older adults or anybody in general, using more principles of universal design, because a lot of times technology gets shelved because people don't ask, what do the users want? So that's just a little bit of an introduction about myself. And once again, thank you all for this opportunity to present today. Oh, see, that's okay. No problem. All right, awesome, thank you. So your big toe, often we take it for granted, and it has been reported in a lot of research studies that your big toe is associated with your balance and walking and mobility outcomes. And so for the most part, the current methods of measuring big toe strength is either manual muscle testing, toe grip dynamometer, where you clutch a whole bar and pull it down with all your toes. There's also something called the handheld dynamometry, and then they have custom devices built in research lab, just like ours. Essentially, the problem with most of these technologies is that they're mostly either measuring flexion, which is your pushing down of your big toe, and there are very few devices that measure lift and up of your big toe or your great toe extension. And one of the reasons they're not often looked at in research or clinical practice is mainly because of how subjective the nature is. So as you can see, participants or patients who come into the clinic, whenever they need to have their toe strength measured, the clinician presses down on their big toe and then asks them to resist the force, or pushes on their big toe and asks them to push down as hard as they can. So you can see how that can be very subjective. So I could score the person, and the scoring for that manual muscle testing, which is also the current clinical standard to measure muscle strength, it goes from 1 to 5 based on the person measuring it. So I could rate them a 5, you could rate them a 3, another person could rate them a 2. And so there's no real way to say what their actual toe strength is. And so because of these problems, we decided we wanted to work on something that's a little bit more objective and provides a little more accurate information about your big toe. And while there have been a lot of improvements in different technologies and measuring devices that use that, like the handheld dynamometry, which is a similar process as your manual muscle testing, but they use this dynamometer instead to push down on your muscles or your big toe to get the measurement, once again making it a little bit subjective. So most of the advances in technologies have been in these devices, or they focus more on pressure mats or insoles that measure pressure. And not many have looked at particularly your great toe extension strength measurement. And the reason I bring that up multiple times today is because that was the primary inspiration of this device that we have. Spoiler alert, we built our own device. It's called the toe scale. Essentially, we worked with a physical therapist who was working with people with chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, which is a neurological condition where you start losing sensation at the tips of your toes and toes and your hands and fingertips, and it progresses from the distal part, which is at the very tip, towards the central part. So what we've noticed in literature, and here's the kicker, because the first muscle that loses strength when you develop peripheral neuropathy, it has been reported, is your big toe extension muscle. And so now that tells you why this is important and why we need better measures to measure your big toe strength, particularly your extension. So we built the toe scale, and now we've had multiple participants come in, do pilot testing to see what the data looks like. And one of the unique features of our device is, unlike all the other methods where they give you a maximum score saying this is your maximum strength, our device measures 10 seconds. So that's 10 seconds of force time curve is the output. And that we think could be more helpful in telling us what your big toe strength could look like in that 10-second duration, that could answer some questions maybe about your balance or mobility or just in general muscle health. So after the pilot testing, now we finally decided we want to do a larger study. And the two main aims of our study was, one, to characterize the output that I just mentioned, the force time curve from the toe scale, and also compare the different measures or features we extract from this curve against measures of your functional mobility, and also to look at the differences based on demographics like age and sex. And the second aim, because this is a relatively new device, was to also determine how reliable it is, and if different people were to use it to measure the strength, is it still giving us the similar consistent values for the same person? And I do want to preface this by letting you all know that in our original pilot testing that we did compare the results of manual muscle testing against the toe scale that we have now, and multiple participants that were scored a 4 or a 4+, which is in the 1 to 5 scale on the manual muscle testing, did have a much larger difference observed when we measured in the toe scale. So we think that our device could potentially be more discriminatory in terms of measuring the muscle strength across different participants. As for our methods for this larger study, and I do want to say, I feel like a lot of you have already known about the study or come in to participate, and I'm happy to finally be able to share what we've done and let you all know that your data is just not sitting at a computer. Basically, this is a cross-sectional observational study, mainly to determine the reliability of the device and also observe the differences in your big toe strength across different demographics and see how it associates with your functional mobility and balance scores. Our main sample inclusion criteria for the participants that we included was just healthy individuals over the age of 18 years, and just that no major balance or mobility impairments or gait impairments. We did not restrict or have any other strict exclusion criteria because, like I said, this is still in the beginning stages of this research using this device. So we want to make sure we can get enough data from individuals that don't have any impairments that are significant so that we can try to determine maybe eventually some level of cutoff scores to determine which would be a good toe strength, which would be an okay toe strength, which is poor toe strength. And maybe this could help inform clinicians to provide intervention strategies, maybe to exercise your big toe. So for our data analysis, what we've done here today that I'll be presenting today is mainly just the descriptive statistics, so which is looking at your mean and standard deviations of the different measures of the toe strength. And then we also did independent sample t-tests to compare between different age groups and also between different sex. And the three main outcomes that we've analyzed today are the big toe strength. We've done both extension and flexion. So that's another additional feature of our device. And also the hand grip strength and the timed up and go. And although we did the mini balance evaluation systems test, we haven't analyzed that in the data today, mainly because we wanted to look at the functional mobility data and we want to dive deeper into the balance assessment using our motion capture system. And I haven't had a chance to do that yet. So essentially, before I move into the results, I do want to mention why we measured hand grip strength, because that's a common question I've had before. It's mainly because the current practice in clinics is to use hand grip strength as one of the measures of overall muscle health and muscle performance. And so we're trying to see if our toe strength is associated with the hand grip strength. If so, if it's very highly correlated, then you might as well lose the great toe strength, because then that would just mean that your hand grip strength is telling you what you need. So this is a way for us to make sure that we're not measuring something that's already been done before, and this is a necessary measurement. Once again, tying back to the interests of make sure it's useful to the people that need it and not just build something because you can. And the next step in our data analysis methods would be to use machine learning, using the data that we have now, first from the traditional analyses of just regular statistics. We want to use machine learning to automatically detect different features in the output curve, which I'll show you all in a minute here. But I do have some machine learning results from our very pilot data, like the very initial data, which I'll be talking about today. Right, so for the strength assessment, some of you might recognize these environments. As you can see, we have the hand grip strength that we measured using a Jamar hand grip dynamometer. Then we did the great toe strength measurement. Here we do have a light board that goes with it. The concept being very similar to your strong arm at a carnival. And basically the more force you apply, more lights go up or down. And we've noticed when the light board is there, people really enjoy doing it and they do put in more effort, and that's an additional motivation when compared to no light boards. And here it's an image of the output that we get from our motion capture system when we're doing the mini best balance evaluations test. I just wanted to share that here to show that this is a next step of our assessments to look into the biomechanics and see how it compares to the different great toe strength measures. So coming into the actual output, this is the 10-second duration of the force time curve that I was talking about, which is the output of our toe scale. Basically for this analysis, to answer aim 1, where we're trying to characterize this output curve, we looked at 4 different features. One being obviously the peak force that you can generate. The next one was to look at the 80% of the peak force and the time it took for you to reach the 80% of your peak force. And the average toe strength that is annotated here in green is the average after reaching your 80% of your toe strength force. And the reason I say 80% so many times is because in literature, what they've mentioned is when you're measuring toe strength or any muscle strength for that matter, isometrically, which is against a hard surface, essentially, trying to see how hard you can push. That's the isometric measurement of muscle strength. They say at 80% of your peak force, all of your motor neurons are recruited after that 80% has been reached. So we used 80% as the cutoff for our characterization. And to add to the whole feature list, so basically we have the maximum, the time it took to reach 80% of the peak or rise time. And then we have the average after reaching 80%. And the fourth feature is RFD, or the rate of force development, which basically looks at how fast you got to the 80% of the peak. So that's calculated by dividing the 80% of the peak by the rise time. And you'll see further in my results why that's also an important measure to look at. So just an overview of the sample that we had. We analyzed a total of 30 participants. We had 14 younger adults and 16 older adults. And thank you very much for participating. So for the most part, apart from the age, of course, the other variables like your weight, height, and BMI did not vary significantly between the two groups. So we just have a more equally distributed sample in those metrics. And I know this table is a lot, and so I'm hoping I can make this easier by highlighting some of the interesting results that we found, is looking at different variables here. As you can see, it's mainly looking at the peak, looking at right extension strength, right flexion strength, left extension strength, and left flexion strength. And the negative just indicates flexion and the positive indicates extension. There's no other meaning to it. It's just easier for anybody dealing with the numbers. Basically, what we've looked at is that there are significant differences between the age groups in some of the measures, particularly the right flexion measure in the peak and the average, as well as the rate of force development, and also with the left flexion with the rate of force development. So you can see how even though your peak forces may not have varied, the amount of time it took to reach the peak force has varied between age groups. And that's why your rate of force development is so different between the two groups. And so that just shows how fast or how quickly you can generate those forces. And that could potentially tell us more about your balance or mobility, which we're hoping to see in the future. And these were the more significant results that were different. And as you can see, between males and females, I did not highlight too many, and you don't see as many differences that are statistically significant, mainly because I'm gonna go back one slide just to show you all that the distribution between males and females is a little skewed. We had 22 female participants and 8 males overall. So we did not see as many significant results between males and females, but we do see a lot of other variables that have very large differences between the groups, including between younger and older adults, as well as between males and females. You can see how many of these variables have large differences, but also are not statistically significant. And another reason is also the variability that you see with the standard deviations for each of these measures is a little high. So I'm hoping, and as we collect more data, we are still recruiting. So as we collect more data, I'm hoping to have a more equally distributed sample to have a more accurate results and understanding. Yes. So the question that was asked was why the values here are negative. And I do want to emphasize that all the flexion values will be negative and extension positive, and that's just for us to deal with the numbers. Because when the device measures flexion is going down and going up as extension, so the output we get are just positive and negative to indicate the movement, but it does not indicate good or bad or negative peak. So essentially, even if the peak is 49 here, or the rate of force development is negative 49, I would say that the peak flexion force is 49 newtons versus saying it's negative 49. The negative is just indicating the movement of extension or flexion. Yes, it's directionality to say that you're pushing down is flexion is negative. That is correct. So the comment that was made was the 49 would still be higher than the 32, and that is correct. So the negative sign is merely just for directionality. And as I mentioned, I'm still an engineer, so I like the numbers to make a little bit more sense to me, and that's why I have it that way. But these were some of the results that we saw in terms of the differences between males and females and older and younger adults. And I do want to show you all, particularly the rise time that I was talking about earlier that affects your rate of force development, is you'll see that older adults had a longer rise time, is essentially indicating that older adults took a little longer to reach their peak when compared to younger adults. But that did not necessarily mean they had lower force, because as you can see with the right extension, right foot extension force, you can see that older adults did have a slightly higher peak strength when compared to younger adults. And of course, even it was not significant, but I'm just saying that maybe that's another reason why we should consider more than just the peak force, because you can't really tell much. There might be some people who might have been lifelong athletes that might have just really exceptional toe strength when compared to somebody who's been more sedentary and maybe significantly younger too. So we had some participants, we had in our very first testing, and most of you might have already heard this story, but we did have middle school girls come in and have a much higher toe strength than most adults. And we found out they were just ballet dancers. So that was the surprising part. But that's basically to show you or tell you all that the peak strength does not necessarily give you the whole picture. And that's why we need to look at all of these different variables and how they can relate to the different measures of your functional mobility or balance and other biomechanics. And oh, it's a little off. I think the slides are different, but I'll go back one slide. The other thing I wanted to show after that slide was to show you all that with your grip strength and your timed up and go, which is named tug here, there was no statistical difference between older adults or younger adults, and there were no differences that were statistically significant between males and females either. And the grip strength between left and right were also comparable across all groups, except between males and females that you see here that males had a significantly higher grip strength when compared to females. But then again, also the sample size is skewed and we do have a large variability here. When we're especially looking at any differences between males and females in this study at the moment, with the 30 participants that have completed all visits, we're extra careful with the interpretation because of the skewed sample. Essentially, which brings me then to the correlations that I was talking to you about. um, looking at how the different measures of your toe strength would correlate with your functional mobility as measured by the timed up and go. And as you can see, while we have and I didn't do the same for males and females mainly because of the skewed sample. I did not want to add that information here yet. But looking at the differences in the correlations, basically the negative here just indicates that timed up and go is measured in seconds. So if you have a higher peak strength, and that would just mean that, and if you had a really good functional mobility assessment where you completed in lesser time, the correlation once again would be negative for those variables. Once again, just more so, yeah. Yeah. So the question was asking how the timed up and go is evaluated. It's basically a clinical measure with a distance of 3 meters marked on the floor, with the person starting in a seated position. And then once I read out the instructions, the person is asked to get up from the chair, walk across the distance marked off with a tape on the floor, come back to sit in the chair. And so it's usually timed to see how long it takes the person to go from being seated all the way to the end of that distance, turn around and come back to sit. And we do not ask them to walk as quickly as they can, but it's asking them to walk at their normal pace because we want to see more of a day-to-day functional mobility versus doing your best. So that's how the timed up and go is measured, and the time it takes to complete that task. It does have different cutoff scores which indicate fall risk. So if it takes you longer than 13 seconds to complete that task, you're considered to be a fall risk when compared to being less than completing the task in less than 13 seconds. And that is something I'm hoping to use in the next set of analyses to see if I can try to correlate some of the measures that we have from our toe strength to that cutoff score to see if we can identify a similar cutoff score for our own measurement. But one of the interesting things that I want to show you all here is the differences in correlation between younger and older adults looking at the functional mobility. Is you'll see that most of the associations of all the different measures for your right foot extension and flexion, left foot extension and flexion, they're all higher among older adults when it's relating to your functional mobility when compared to the younger adults. And similarly, there is a smaller correlation of your grip strength with the functional mobility across all groups when compared to different toe strength measures, as you can see, which basically indicates that maybe your grip strength is not telling you as much about your functional mobility as the toe strength could, because let's face it, not all of us walk on our hands, right? So this is basically a good place for me, I guess, to begin looking at potentially separating out the groups based on age to at least look at all the different measures with the biomechanics that we've collected, which I'm yet to do, and that will be part of my next steps. And going from there to see what we can gather and how that information can be useful in clinical practice. So moving into the second aim of my study, which was to mainly look at the reliability of my device. This is looking at, once again, the same two groups between older adults and younger adults, looking at the same peak force across all participants. We're looking at, we did the peak force just so we can look at the reliability of getting the peak force for all participants, because that's the data available for other methodologies in literature. So for comparability, We've done only the peak force for now, but I intend to do the same with all the other measures that we've collected. And what we can see here, except for the annotated or highlighted values for younger adults for right extension force, all the other values are above 0.84, which indicates a very high reliability of the device. So the first column here shows inter-rater reliability. For those of you that already participated in the study, you know there were two people measuring your toe strength. So inter-rater reliability is looking at one person measuring versus the other person measuring. The acceptance between the two is pretty high because all of the values are well above 8.85. So essentially indicating more than an 85% acceptability of the, or the consistency of more than 85% between the two people measuring the toe strength. And then here what we have is intra-rater reliability, which is looking at one rater measuring multiple trials. So for instance, I measure 3 trials of your toe strength, and I'm trying to look at how reliable I am to see if I'm measuring consistently across those 3 trials. And what we noticed, once again, was except for the right extension force, all the others did have more than 0.84 as the reliability or the ICC values. And these two particularly low values, I am hypothesizing because the right extension force is the first thing that we measure. And there is a chance that a lot of people are still getting used to the protocol and they're not 100% sure what is expected of them. And I'm hoping maybe, and I've modified the protocol since then to add a few more statements into my instructions to try and keep this more consistent. As you can see, older adults did a lot better because you all understood a lot better what was supposed to be done. So we need to make sure that we can get a similar reliability among younger adults as well, but that's what we are hoping to do with the standardizing the protocol. And throughout the process, we did want to hear feedback from our participants because we want to make sure we're trying to do what's more acceptable and user-friendly and not try to stick to something if it's not working. And now this is going back to our old machine learning results that I did want to bring up today just to talk about what we had seen in our past data collection, which was a lot less rigorous than what we're doing now. Is what we noticed is we used 3 different machine learning models to try and just classify based on age and sex. And we noticed accuracy scores of 55%, 66%, and 77% being the highest for when the classifier we used was the K nearest neighbors classifier with 10 as our K value. And essentially, the reason I bring this up here is because the data that we had only a single trial for a participant, and this had 31 participants. And we did have a significant imbalance between sexes then as well. And so the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times many researchers use test accuracy as a metric to measure how good their machine learning model is performing, but nowadays we're learning more that the accuracy is not sufficient to measure how accurate your model is. You need other scores such as the area under the curve. There's a receiver operating curve that you can calculate, basically how sensitive to differences between the 2 groups your model is and how specific it is in terms of basically what the model is trying to do when it's calculating your AUC scores is to see how many true positives or true negatives, false positives and false negatives it is, and it gives you a ratio, and that's the score here. So the higher the ratio, better your model. And so what we did notice, because our age distribution was more equal, we had 14 and 17 older and younger adults, we did see a higher AUC score, whereas the differences in sex basically were much lower than 0.5, which indicate that the machine learning models weren't really classifying anything accurately. They were just doing it out of memory, and that was pretty much it. So this is, however, still indicative that maybe machine learning could be useful in terms of classifying. And here, what we used was the whole output curve. We didn't use any of the features we extracted manually. So if this can do it for the whole curve, we're hoping we can introduce our own manually extracted features to provide more information to these models to then maybe help us get better with the classification. So in conclusion, the main takeaways what we have are that overall males did perform better in their great toe strength. And once again, want to acknowledge the limitation of the skewed sample distribution between males and females. And also, for the most part, younger adults did outperform older adults in the great toe strength measurement as well, although we didn't see significant differences that can be attributed to the variability we had for each participant. And also, in terms of the correlations or associations, we did see the great toe strength measures had a higher correlation with your functional mobility outcome. And it was higher, particularly in older adults when compared to younger adults, which could indicate that there is something of importance here that the grip strength may not be able to capture as it relates to age. And finally, the next steps for our study would be to try and balance out the existing sample that we have to make sure that the sample distribution is more equal between the different groups, and also to try and use machine learning to also automatically pick out the different features for us to see if those features can be clinically interpretable, because that's our goal, is to make sure that whatever we use, a lot of times machine learning models are all just numbers and may not have clinical significance or importance. And it's better if we can find some features that are extracted that can be more clinically relevant and can be useful to develop intervention strategies. And that's kind of all I had for my talk today, but I do have the device with me, and I'll be setting it up in the back if anyone wants to come give it a try. And of course, want to thank all of you for your time today, and also everybody at OCAMIC for their time and resources to help with this study. And also the Department of Occupational Therapy and my lab, the Technology for Occupational Performance Lab. And of course, my mentor, Dr. Hongwu Wang, without whom I wouldn't be here today. So thank you very much.
I'm sure there'll be questions. So again, I will take the first one since I have the microphone in my hand. If you do this test with one person, say me, an old person, and we do it 10 times, do you see a statistical significance in the learning curve or the person performing the test?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons we have the differences that I showed in the reliability for younger adults with their first test, which is the right extension. As we did more trials, there was that learning curve effect where there was more reliability across all measurements. So we do also notice that regardless of the age, we do 6 trials in our current study, basically for each movement. So extension or flexion, we do 6 trials per foot. And we do notice as the number of trials increases, the force does get more consistent and more, it gets somewhat more consistent, essentially.
And the next question is, having done the test and you have a number, let's say my number is 13, whatever that means, is there a level at which you can determine whether I am subject to fall or do I walk well or whatever? And does that correlate well across all ages?
I think that's the question we do want to answer, mainly because, and that's why we're trying to collect data from individuals that don't have major problems to at least define a normative by age. And then we can start looking at um, the functional mobility cutoff scores and also the biomechanical data analysis that is yet to be done. We're hoping to see if there are any correlations with specific measures for hypothesizing, particularly the rate of force development. In addition to your peak force, that could be indicative of maybe one of those different changes in your biomechanics that could be indicative of fall or fall risk. And we want to try and see if we can get to the bottom of that.
Okay, I will now take the microphone around and let other people ask questions. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It was very good. Is that, now I'm eating it. I'm assuming that with PT, you can increase the toe strength, the hallux toe strength. And if you had people, then you send them to do that, then you remeasure and then look at the gait and the strength and so forth. That would be really good. That would really help your study and show the importance of it and that it was meaningful and you could change it. Just a side thing was from radiation, we have neuropathy in hands and feet. I also deal with how to do that. Okay, but that might be something that you could then say, well, we could do this before, after, help these people get back into a situation that's really good. And then that shows the importance of your study and maybe get you more grants.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And to that, I do also want to let you know that that's what I was talking about when I was mentioning earlier. The inspiration came from people going through chemotherapy. Is peripheral neuropathy is a neurological condition that has no known cure so far. It is a progressive condition. So what we noticed was if the toe strength is the one that's affected first, if we can measure, like you said, throughout the process of chemotherapy, maybe eventually this device could be an early indicator of developing neuropathy or progression of neuropathy, where the person that's undergoing chemotherapy may not necessarily be able to say no to it, but they can at least talk to their oncologist to see if the dosage can be modified, maybe to still provide the treatment they need and still delay the onset or progression of the condition.
Thank you. Dr. Abrams, UC San Francisco, did studies and put it out in conferences, and lion's mane mushrooms, believe it or not, especially from one place in the country, will not only, he says, prevent, but if it happens and they're not prevented, it will bring back feeling in hands and toes. You might want to look him up.
It's actually super interesting. I will look it up. Thank you.
I just want to, in our culture, women have had the tendency to have footwear that constrains their feet in many cases. And I wondered if how straight the toe is makes a difference, and is there any evaluation of that in your study?
That would be very interesting to find out, because we, like I said, currently, because this is a relatively new device, we're trying to focus on making sure it's measuring what we want it to measure, and it can identify the differences between the different groups. Our next study, hopefully also part of my dissertation, might be that we look at people with different neurological conditions, maybe start with peripheral neuropathy because that's been reported multiple times, to see if our device can do that same thing of discriminating between individuals with and without neuropathy. And I think from there, we do want to try and look at those as well, because there are reports on individuals with hallux valgus deformities, and that might be coming from shoes or bunions and other problems that relate to your big toe because of the shoes or type of footwear you wear, and that we do want to look into. But right now, because it's still in its infancy, we're trying to make sure the device works well before we check into that. But thank you very much.
Thank you. So I noticed in the photo that you showed of the subject being tested, they were seated.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I can see that being useful for standardization,
Mhm.
but in terms of functionality, it seems to me that having a person standing, if there was a way to standardize that, would be a more functional test. And I know you were working just to validate the device, so good job on that. And but that, and also then if once you prove that the validity, which you're doing, then looking at training protocols and the efficacy of them and their efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the questions all of our participants have had too. And I do want to point out here that one of the reasons we do see a lot more difference in the flexion forces, which is pushing down versus extension raising up, is from having that seated position, because being seated provides more of an anatomical neutral position to measure your extension strength. But we do notice standing up provides that additional force you need from gravity for your flexion. But because we want to standardize between the two, extension and flexion, we've had both measurements done in a seated position. But eventually, hopefully, the long-term goal for this device is to be an in-home technology, like your weighing scale. So you weigh yourself, then you measure your toe strength yourself, and then someday it drops out of the blue and you can just call your PCP and say, hey, maybe something's up. You want to check it out? But that's kind of the goal, and hopefully we'll get to that level of standardization once we have more data. But thank you very much.
I was going to suggest that your dissertation begin with an explanation of how important the great toe is for balance and gait. Otherwise, people will be thinking, why are we spending money on this?
Yeah. That's definitely been one of the things I usually, before I start most of my presentations, I tell them, yeah, I know it's the great toe. It's nothing weird. We just take it for granted. But like you said, it is important that a lot of people don't realize how important your big toe is. And just to imagine for all of you right now as well, if you've used one of those foams or been on any kind of uneven platform before, if you can think back as to how you maintained your balance, you might remember that you're pressing down a little bit with your big toe to kind of hold your position. And that's one of the other reasons. And like you said, I do want to try and make sure we put it out there as to why.
People who lose their big toes in amputations or accidents have to learn how to walk again. The great deal of therapy is required.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that'll be, yeah, there's just so many questions that you can answer with this. And I'm happy that there are so many, but also at the same time, I feel like there's never enough time to do everything at once. But definitely want to look into it. So yeah. Yeah, they definitely want to look into that. Thank you.
Raghu, one of the things I was wondering as one of your participants is that I know this is all about validation of your scale, and you have a long ways to go before you get where you want. But doing a known group difference in which you're collecting data on falls would have been really, really helpful, because you could simply add that to your database, and in the future, you might be able to detect some differences in known groups.
Yeah, absolutely. To answer that question as well, this is part one of our IRB that we submitted. Part two does involve looking at known groups validity by looking at one of the different groups for toe strength. So we just hadn't decided which group to look at yet, but what you're saying actually makes a lot more sense in terms of its relevance at this point. And definitely going to bring it up with my mentor later today. So thank you.
Any other questions? I have another question. Would there be any importance if you were to make a total toe measurement thing? And that way, if someone had lost a big toe, you could have some information about whether the other toes pick up the load.
Yeah, that's something I would definitely need to look into to see if I'm sure there are some studies out there that have already tried to look at the pressure distribution under the foot. And I would love to know the answer to that as well, but maybe it'll be something that's part of my part 3 that we do as part of the study.
Raghu, I want to congratulate you first on a very well-designed, balanced study, looking at a lot of variables. My question is how, I may have missed it. How did you check for balance?
So we use the mini balance evaluation systems test.
What is that?
It basically has about 14 different items that looks at static balance, dynamic balance during walking, and also some posturography, which basically looks at your sway in static position on
I
different
see.
surfaces.
I see.
And during the measurement of that is when we use the motion capture system, and that data I have not analyzed yet.
I was going to ask, what's your thing there? Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I'm hoping next ILR research competition in
Right,
aging,
next
I'll
year.
bring the data for sure.
Next.
Are there any other questions at all? Here's another one.
Not really a question, but several people I know in here have taken or are taking a Tai Chi class that we have here. And one of the things that the instructor stresses, walking, heel, ball, toe, heel, ball, toe. And I found myself when I feel uneasy, I'm in my mind, I'm like a tree frog. I just put all 5 toes down and it stops you in traction and it keeps you from falling.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed since starting this research too, is how many different things we use our big toe for and not realize. And it's been a nice learning curve for me.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming, and you're going to set up your machine in the back and we can test it out. Next week, we are going to have, again, some